Walk through the streets of Florence, Paris, or Vienna today, and the continent looks timeless. Cafes bustle with patrons, museums are crowded, and life seems comfortable, almost enviable. But beneath this polished surface, Europe's economic foundations are cracking. For centuries, Europe was the heart of global commerce, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, the banker of empires, and a hub of consumption. Today, economists whisper a harsher truth. Europe is no longer the unstoppable engine it once was. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the United States has nearly doubled its economic output, while the Eurozone has barely grown. Even poorer American states now rival European living standards. This isn't a minor slowdown, it's the result of 6 structural wounds that are draining the continent. The first 2 are the most immediate: the collapse of Europe's energy system and the continent's demographic decline. For decades, Europe's industrial engine, particularly Germany, relied on a simple formula: high-tech expertise fueled by cheap Russian gas. Giants like BASF, Volkswagen, and steelmakers thrived under this model. That stability ended abruptly in February 2022, when the Nord Stream pipelines were severed. Europe didn't just lose a supplier, lost the foundation of its industrial economy. Meanwhile, the US enjoys affordable shale gas at around $23 per MMBTU. Europe, in contrast, must import liquefied natural gas from the US and Qatar at a significant premium. Industrial electricity costs have tripled compared to the US and China. Factories can no longer compete. Iconic companies are relocating production, not for labor cost advantages, but for energy affordability. BASF is shrinking in Germany and investing $10 billion in China. Europe is exporting GDP and importing unemployment. Factories close, never to return. The second wound is demographic. Europe is literally aging out of existence. The replacement fertility rate is 2.1 children per woman. Yet the EU averages just 1.46. In Italy and Spain, it hovers around 1.2. By 2050, the working-age population could shrink by 35 million, effectively eliminating Germany's workforce. Europe's generous social systems, healthcare, pensions, early retirement, depend on a growing workforce. That model is collapsing. From 4 workers per retiree in the 1960s to fewer than 2 by 2050, capital is diverted from innovation to pensions and elder care. Europe risks becoming a geriatric economy as young talent migrates to higher-paying, lower-tax countries. Even if Europe could survive these first 2 wounds, the next 2 are largely Europe's regulatory environment has stifled innovation. While the US and China compete fiercely for technological dominance, Europe has retreated, prioritizing rules over results. The continent once housed 41 of the world's 100 most valuable companies. Today, only 15 remain. There is no European Google, Amazon, Nvidia, or OpenAI. The digital revolution largely passed Europe by leaving a barren ecosystem, except for a few industrial champions, like ASML and SAP. The so-called Brussels effect explains much of this. Europe has chosen regulation as its competitive edge. Startups face a labyrinth of rules: GDPR, the Digital Services Act, and now the EU AI Act. AI companies in France or Germany often relocate to the US to avoid the prohibitive cost of compliance. The market capitalization of the Magnificent Seven US tech giants exceeds that of the combined stock markets of Great Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. Europe is a digital colony, dependent on US platforms, algorithms, and infrastructure. At the same time, Europe's financial system is bleeding capital. Europeans save diligently, yet much of that wealth funds US debt and tech ventures rather than local growth. The continent incubates talent and provides initial risk capital, but the rewards are harvested abroad. Spotify, BioNTech, are all listed in New York, not Europe. This fragmented market structure, coupled with punitive taxation, forces European capital to flee, leaving factories unfunded and startups stunted. The final 2 wounds affect Europe's geopolitical and political strength. Militarily, the continent is weak. Germany's Bundeswehr, once the front line against the Soviet Union, has munitions for only days of conflict. The UK maintains its smallest army since the Napoleonic Wars, and France lacks the capacity for sustained operations. Europe relies on the US for defense. Without Washington's support, the continent cannot protect itself. Politically, Europe is paralyzed. Decisions require unanimous consent among 27 nations, making rapid responses impossible. In crises, speed is everything. The US president can act in minutes. The EU takes months of negotiation. This gridlock fuels populism and extremist movements. Across Germany, France, Italy, and beyond, far-right parties are gaining influence, making federalized solutions necessary for Europe's survival virtually impossible. Europe today risks the fate of Venice in the 15th century: wealthy, beautiful, and irrelevant. The 21st century's defining decisions, in AI, energy, space, and military power, will be made elsewhere, while Europe remains a tourist destination for the world's winners. The 6 fatal wounds are clear. Cheap energy vanished. Demographics collapsed. Innovation was regulated away. Capital fled. Militaries weakened. And political paralysis prevented meaningful action. For investors, Europe is a value trap. Superficially cheap, but structurally decaying. Growth is gone. Demographics are unfavorable. And geopolitical risks loom large. Capital flows where it is valued. And increasingly, that is not Europe. The continent's story is a cautionary tale. But similar paths could befall other nations if debt and policy missteps go unchecked. The next chapter in this series will explore America's gold seizure in 1933, exposing the legal and financial precedents that could affect your wealth today. Have you ever wondered why Europe, the continent that once dominated the world economy, now seems to be slowly unraveling? On the surface, cities like Paris, Vienna, and Florence look timeless and beautiful. Cafes are full, museums are crowded, and life seems comfortable, almost enviable. But beneath the charm, Europe's economic foundations are cracking. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the US economy has nearly doubled in size, while Europe's growth has stagnated. Even poorer American states now rival European living standards. This isn't just a slowdown to S, the result of 6 structural wounds that are bleeding Europe dry. Today, we'll explore the first 2, Europe's energy collapse and its demographic crisis. For decades, Germany and, by extension, Europe ran its industrial powerhouse on a simple formula: advanced engineering plus cheap Russian gas. Companies like BASF, Volkswagen, and steelmakers thrived on abundant, affordable energy. That stability ended abruptly in February 2022, when the Nord Stream pipelines were cut off. Europe didn't just lose a supplier, it lost the foundation of its industrial economy. Now, Europe imports liquefied natural gas from the US and Qatar at a huge premium. Industrial electricity prices are 2 to 3 times higher than in the US or China. Factories can no longer compete. Iconic companies are moving production abroad, not for cheaper labor, but for cheaper energy. BASF, for instance, is downsizing in Germany and investing billions in China. Europe is exporting GDP and importing unemployment, and many of these factories are gone for good. If energy is a sudden heart attack, Europe's demographic crisis is a slow-acting cancer. The replacement fertility rate is 2.1 children per woman, but the EU averages just 1.46. Italy and Spain hover near 1.2. By 2050, Europe could lose 35 million working-age adults, the equivalent of Germany's entire workforce. Europe's social safety, net healthcare, pensions, early retirement, was built on the assumption of a growing workforce. But today, there are fewer than 3 workers for every retiree, and by 2050, there will be fewer than 2. Capital that could be invested in startups, AI, and infrastructure is consumed by pensions and elder care. Europe risks becoming a geriatric economy, while young talent leaves for higher-paying, lower-tax countries. Even if Europe could survive these first 2 wounds, the next 2 are largely self. The continent has created a regulatory environment that stifles innovation. While the US and China battle for technological supremacy, Europe has retreated, prioritizing rules over results. Once home to 41 of the world's top 100 companies, Europe now hosts just 15. There is no European Google, Amazon, Nvidia, or OpenAI. The so-called Brussels effect has prioritized regulation over innovation. GDPR, the Digital Services Act, and the EU AI Act all slow startups before they can scale. Many move abroad, incorporating in Delaware, to survive legally and financially. The results are staggering. The market capitalization of the 7 largest US tech companies exceeds the combined stock markets of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. Europe is a digital colony, dependent on American platforms, algorithms, and infrastructure. Europe's financial system compounds the problem. Europeans save diligently, but much of that capital funds US debt and tech companies rather than local growth. The continent incubates talent and assumes initial risk, but the rewards are harvested abroad. Spotify, BioNTech are all listed in New York, not Europe. This capital flight starves local economies of the money needed to fund factories, research, and jobs. High taxes on wealth and capital gains accelerate the problem. Investors vote with their feet, moving their money where it can grow, leaving Europe financially weaker year after year. Europe's fifth wound is its military and geopolitical irrelevance. The continent is militarily weak, relying heavily on the US for defense. Germany's Bundeswehr can sustain only a few days of high-intensity combat. The UK's army is the smallest it has been since the Napoleonic Wars. Even France, with capable forces, lacks the depth for a prolonged conflict. Europe's reliance on US military power makes it a spectator in global geopolitics. With American attention shifting toward the Pacific, Europe has no plan B. Its economic strength is dwarfed by its inability to defend itself, and the world takes notice. Finally, Europe is politically paralyzed. Decisions require unanimity among 27 nations, slowing action to a crawl. Populist movements are rising. Frustrated with Brussels' inability to address industrialization, migration, or inflation, far-right parties are gaining influence across Germany, France, Italy, and beyond, making the possibility of a unified federal Europe necessary to respond to these crises nearly impossible. Europe's six wounds are clear: the collapse of cheap energy, a declining population, regulation stifling innovation, capital flight, military weakness, and political paralysis. The continent risks the fate of Venice, rich, beautiful, but increasingly irrelevant. The decisions shaping the 21st century in AI, energy, space, and geopolitics will be made elsewhere, while Europe becomes a place for tourists, not leaders. For investors, the warning is stark. Europe is a value trap. Growth is gone, demographics are adverse, and geopolitical risk is high. Capital flows to where it is valued on. Increasingly, that is not Europe. Europe's story is also a warning for the world. The next video will uncover America's gold seizure of 1933, a historical example showing how governments can legally seize wealth during crises. Could it happen again today, even with Bitcoin, gold, or retirement accounts? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss this explosive revelation. If you walk through Europe today, it may look like nothing has changed. The streets of Paris, Florence, and Vienna are bustling. Cafes overflow, museums are filled with tourists, and life seems comfortable, even enviable. But that's only the surface. Beneath the charm, the continent's economy is cracking under pressures that have been building for decades. What looks like stability is actually the calm before a storm. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the US economy has nearly doubled, while Europe has barely grown. Even the poorest American states now rival the average European's standard of living. This isn't a simple slowdown. This is the consequence of six structural wounds, flaws that are bleeding the continent dry and slowly eroding its relevance in the modern world. The first of these wounds is energy. For decades, Europe, and Germany in particular, relied on a simple formula: advanced engineering powered by cheap Russian gas. This formula created industrial giants, from chemical companies like BASF to car makers like Volkswagen. It seemed unstoppable. But in February 2022, that system collapsed almost overnight. The Nord Stream pipelines were cut off, and Europe lost not just a supplier but the foundation of its industrial model. The cost of energy skyrocketed. Europe now relies on liquefied natural gas from the US and Qatar, which is far more expensive. Industrial electricity costs are now 2 to 3 times higher than in the United States or China. Factories cannot compete under these conditions. Some of Europe's most iconic companies are relocating production not to find cheaper labor, but to find cheaper energy. BASF, for example, is shrinking in Germany while investing billions in China. Europe is exporting GDP and importing unemployment. Factories are closing, and many will never return. The second wound is demographic. Europe is literally aging out of its workforce. The replacement rate required to maintain a stable population is 2.1 children per woman. In the EU, the average is just 1.46, with Italy and Spain near 1.2. By 2050, Europe may lose 35 million working-age adults, the equivalent of Germany's entire workforce disappearing. Europe's social safety nets, pensions, healthcare, early retirement, were built on the assumption of a growing workforce. But today, there are fewer than 3 workers for every retiree, and by 2050, there will be fewer than 2. Capital that should be invested in startups, AI, and infrastructure is instead consumed by pensions and nursing homes. Young people leave for higher wages and lower taxes in the United States. Australia, and elsewhere. The continent risks becoming a geriatric economy, with the few remaining young people supporting a large aging population. Even if Europe could survive these first two wounds, the next two are largely self-inflicted. The regulatory environment has become a chokehold on innovation. While the United States and China fight for technological supremacy, Europe has pulled back, favoring rules over risk and bureaucracy over growth. In 2000, Europe had 41 of the world's top 100 companies. Today, it has only 15. There is no European Google, Amazon, Nvidia, or Open. The so-called Brussels effect has made regulation Europe's comparative advantage, but the cost is high. GDPR, the Digital Services Act, and the EU AI Act impose legal hurdles and high compliance costs, forcing startups to relocate to the US. Many companies incorporate in Delaware just to survive. The result is staggering. The 7 largest US tech companies now have a combined market capitalization larger than the stock markets of Great Britain, France, Germany, and Italy together. Europe has become a digital colony, dependent on American platforms, algorithms, and infrastructure. Capital flight compounds the problem. Europeans save more than most other nations, but much of that capital leaves the continent to fund US debt or American tech firms. Europe incubates talent and funds the initial risk, but the rewards are captured elsewhere. Spotify, BioNTech, all list in New York, not Europe. High capital gains taxes accelerate the outflow. Each year, hundreds of billions leave Europe, starving local economies of the money needed to fund factories, research, and jobs. Europe's fifth wound is geopolitical. The continent is militarily weak and relies heavily on the United States for protection. Germany's Bundeswehr has ammunition for just a few days of high-intensity combat. The UK's army is the smallest it has been since the Napoleonic Wars. Even France, while capable, lacks the depth for sustained operations. Europe has assumed that the era of land wars is over, relying on trade, international law, and soft power. That assumption was shattered in 2022. Without the US military and intelligence support, Europe could not have defended Ukraine or even secured its own borders. With American attention shifting to the Pacific, Europe has no plan B. Its economic strength is undermined by its inability to defend itself. The final wound is political paralysis. Europe is made up of 27 nations, with different agendas, and important decisions require unanimity. This makes responding to crises nearly impossible. Populist movements are rising because citizens see Brussels as impotent to stop inflation, deindustrialization, and migration crises. Far-right parties are gaining influence across Germany, France, Italy, and other countries, making a unified federal Europe almost impossible. Without federalization, one army, one treasury, one industrial policy Europe cannot respond effectively to any of its crises. These 6 wounds: energy collapse, demographic decline, regulatory suffocation, capital flight, military weakness, and political paralysis, explain why Europe is losing its economic and geopolitical relevance. The continent risks the fate of Venice in the 15th century, rich, beautiful, and completely irrelevant. The major decisions shaping the 21st century, AI, energy, space, and geopolitics, will happen elsewhere, while Europe becomes a place where the world's winners come on vacation. For investors, Europe is a value trap. It may look cheap, but that price reflects decades of structural decay. Growth is gone, demographics are unfavorable, and geopolitical risk is existential. Capital flows where it is treated best, and where it can grow, and increasingly, that is not Europe. Europe's story is also a warning for the rest of the world. The next video will explore the gold seizure in 1933 in the United States, a historical example showing how governments can legally seize private wealth during a crisis. Could something similar happen today, even with Bitcoin, gold, or retirement accounts? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss this crucial story.